All right, chapter 11 covers sexual reproduction and specifically focuses on the cell division that is critical for creating the gametes that are necessary for sexual reproduction. It's a little unfortunate that the name of the cell division is meiosis, because that name is so similar to the other kind of cell division that you learned, which is mitosis. And both of them are types of cell division. And so meiosis by itself is not the entirety of sexual reproduction, but it is one part of it. But it's just unfortunate that the name meiosis is so similar to that other kind of cell division called mitosis, because they're both cell divisions, but they serve very different purposes in the life of an organism. And so mitosis, which is a part of the bigger process we call the cell cycle, that process starts with one cell. So any one cell most cells can go through mitosis. And so you have one cell, it has a certain number of chromosomes, whatever it is. And let's say it has 20 chromosomes. And then what happens is those chromosomes replicate, and then you have 20 dyad chromosomes. And then the cell goes through prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, and by the end of it, you end up with two cells, which are identical to each other. And they're the same as the cell that had started the division as well. And so it's just a matter of making more cells of exactly the same kinds. So that's mitosis and the cell cycle. And that was in a previous chapter. And you need mitosis to replace cells as other cells. When cells die, you can have a cell that divides to replace the one that died. If there's damage, cells divide to repair and replace the dead cells. Most cells can do mitosis. That's much more of a common cell process that occurs. Now in chapter 11, we're focusing on a different cell division. It's meiosis. And meiosis is part of sexual reproduction. And the kinds of cells, or the cells that can go through meiosis, especially in the animal kingdom, are much more limited. So in your body, most of your cells, you have maybe 20 trillion cells, something like that. Most of them have the ability to do the cell cycle, to do mitosis. It doesn't mean they're always doing that, but they can be activated to divide by a mitosis. But very, very few of the cells in your body can go through the other kind of cell division, this one that's called meiosis. But it's important that at least some cells can go through meiosis, because what meiosis does is the product of the process of meiosis, which by the way is not in of itself a cycle. The cells divide through this process called meiosis, and at the end you have cells that are in a position to, or the first, let's say, the cells that are produced by meiosis represent the first part of the process that we call sexual reproduction. And so that's, there's a very big difference between the purpose of mitosis and the purpose of meiosis. Meiosis doesn't make cells that are identical to each other. And it doesn't make cells that are identical to the cell that started out in the beginning of the process. And so that's, a shift that you want to be very clear about. Otherwise, the risk is that you just mix these two things together. if you don't see clearly the difference between the mitosis and the meiosis, you will probably get bogged down in a lot of details that you may not be able to see the difference. All right, so you want to focus on the difference between the two. Okay, so sexual life cycle, all right, sexual reproduction. I told you that part of sexual reproduction is meiosis. And so meiosis is definitely part of it. The other part of it is something called fertilization. So meiosis is a cell division. Later, fertilization is when two cells fuse together. So fertilization is a fusion of two cells. I'm going to write fusion. So it's when two cells join together and become one cell. So in a lot of ways, fertilization is conceptually the opposite of meiosis, because meiosis takes one cell and divides it into, actually meiosis creates 4 daughter cells or 4 product cells, which we will see, and that's a little different than what mitosis does, because mitosis only makes 2 daughter cells. But fertilization is the fusion of 2 cells that are the products of meiosis. So in the sexual life cycle, there has to be one part of the phase, there have to be at least some cells in the body that can go through the meiosis division, and then there has to be a point where 2 of those types of cells fuse together. That's the sexual life cycle. All right. Okay. So that's an important part. All right. Let's talk a little bit about ploidy. Ploidy refers to a state of a cell. Ploidy. This is the word I'm using here. So ploidy means how many sets of chromosomes are in a cell. So if a cell is monoploid, mono means one, ploid means sets. So a monoploid cell has 1 set of chromosomes. A diploid cell has 2 sets, di is 2. A triploid cell has 3 sets. A tetraploid cell has 4 sets, etc. Pentaploid, hexaploid, these things are possible. It just means how many sets of chromosomes does a cell contain. So the ploidy term is used to describe how many sets of chromosomes are contained in that cell. So a diploid cell contains 2 sets of chromosomes. In humans, each set of chromosomes is 23 chromosomes. So in humans, 23 chromosomes. So there's a chromosome 1 that's really long, and a chromosome 2 that's a little bit shorter, and a chromosome 3 that's a little bit shorter, etc., all the way to chromosome 22. And then you'll remember that the 23rd chromosome can be either an X or a Y chromosome. And so that would be 1 set, 1 of each type. And then the second set of chromosomes that's in the same cell, in the same nucleus of the same cell, would also have 23, also 1 long, 1 medium, 1 small, etc. So 1 of each. So all of them stay in the same nucleus, which means somewhere in that nucleus you have 1 copy of chromosome 1 maybe over here, and another chromosome 1 somewhere over here maybe. If that makes sense. They don't have to come together or anything yet. That will happen later. But somewhere in that nucleus, there's 2 copies of chromosome 1. And I'm not talking about sister chromatids making up 1 dyad. I'm talking about 2 separate monad chromosomes, or if it's in the replicated form, 2 separate dyad chromosomes. And they just coexist in the same nucleus. You have in 2 copies of chromosome 2, somewhere in that nucleus, 2 copies of chromosome 3, all right? And so each type of chromosome, there's 2 of them somewhere in that nucleus. That's what a diploid cell would be. Now, humans, each set of chromosomes is 23 chromosomes. So if you have 2 full sets, then you have 46 chromosomes total in the nucleus of each of your cells. Different animals have different numbers of chromosomes in their sets. Yeast have 16 chromosomes per set. So each cell, a diploid cell, would contain 32 chromosomes total. Trying to think. Drosophila has 8 chromosomes total, so 4 chromosomes per set. So it doesn't, there can be any number of chromosomes in a set, but the number of chromosomes in the set is typically part of the identifying feature of a species. Part of. So anyway. So that's what 2 sets of chromosomes would be. It would mean the cell contains 2 copies of each type of chromosome. So that's important, that this number of sets, that when we use the term diploid, it means 2 sets in the cell. It doesn't describe a chromosome. Remember, a chromosome can either be in the monad form or it can be in the dyad form, and that just depends on whether you're looking at the cell prior to a DNA replication, like S phase, or whether you're looking at the cell after a DNA replication. So the form of the chromosome is a separate issue from the ploidy of the cell. All right? Now, so we said a cell can be monoploid, diploid, triploid. In humans, typically you see diploid cells are typically the rule. Most of your cells are diploid, and then you do have some cells that are monoploid. Those would be, if you're a female, those would be your eggs, and if you're a male, those would be your sperm. So we use a general term that is called haploid. Haploid is a more general term. Haploid means half of the number of sets that most of the cells have. So in humans, most cells have 2 sets. Most cells have 46 chromosomes. So a haploid cell in human, half of 2 sets would be 1 set. And so in humans, your haploid cells would be 1 set of chromosomes. Specifically, we could say monoploid. All right? That's a pretty common situation in the animal kingdom. It's not necessarily true in every animal, and it's also not necessarily true in the plant kingdom and so on, but most of the time in the animal kingdom and in a lot of plants, you have 2 sets of chromosomes, and you have haploid would then be equivalent to 1 set. All right. But I will say that if you have an organism, and this exists in the plant kingdom, if you have an organism where most of the cells in the organism are, let's say, tetraploid, which means each cell contains 4 sets of chromosomes, then haploid cells in that situation would contain 2 sets of chromosomes. So haploid is half the number of sets of whatever most of the other cells have. There's only a small group, usually, of cells that are haploid, and especially in an animal, for example, and those are going to be sex cells or gametes. So gamete is the general term for either egg or sperm. Egg or sperm is more specific. All right. So meiosis is the process. This is really important. Meiosis is the cell division that starts with usually a diploid cell or a cell that is typical for that organism. And by the end of the meiosis, it produces product cells which are haploid. So in humans, let's say this is you. You have reproductive organs. In your reproductive organs, all right, there are cells that can go through this cell division called meiosis, and at the end, those cells are haploid. So most of the cells in your body are diploid, and only the cells in your gonads, that would be ovaries for female, testes for male, will go through the meiotic division to make the gametes. So then the gametes are in your gonads, and so that's where the haploid cells are. All right. So meiosis happens to each individual. It's just a cell division within your body. You don't need anybody else. There's no partner needed for meiosis. Meiosis is just a cell division that some of the cells in your reproductive organs will go through to create the gametes, the eggs or the sperm. Most of those eggs and sperm will die. And that's a relief, because if every egg or every sperm that your body made was eventually going to fertilize something and make a new person, we would have much bigger problem with overpopulation than we have. So most of your eggs and sperm, after they form by meiosis, meiosis is the cell division that makes the eggs and sperm as their product in animals. And then most of them just sit there, all right? Eventually they get released and they die. Occasionally, so meiosis happens more than fertilization. And like I said, meiosis doesn't happen nearly as much as mitosis, because every cell in your body can divide by mitosis. Only a few cells, a small group, can do meiosis. And even a smaller group of those cells will ever complete the second step of the sexual reproduction, which is the fertilization. Fertilization is the fusion. So an egg from one individual that's haploid, an egg that has one set of chromosomes, 23 chromosomes, and a sperm from a different individual, that sperm is also the product of meiosis in that person's body, and that sperm contains one set of chromosomes. When those two fuse together, it creates a new individual. So the fusion or the fertilization completes the sexual life cycle. And that new cell that results from the fusion of two gametes is called the zygote. That's the new individual. Now, the new individual, the zygote, is a fusion of two cells, an egg and a sperm, which are both alive prior to the fusion, and then they create a new combination when they fuse together. They create a new diploid cell, and that zygote is the first diploid cell of the new individual. All right, so that's all we really need to that logic we need to be very clear about. So if you had a monoploid egg, an egg with one set of chromosomes, and a monoploid sperm, and they fuse, then the fusion creates a new cell with one nucleus, and the two nuclei, one from the egg, one from the sperm, fuse. And so now in that nucleus you have two full sets of chromosomes, which means the zygote, that cell, is diploid. Okay, so each individual has diploid cells. A small group of diploid cells go through meiosis to make the haploid gametes. When two haploid gametes from two different individuals fuse, that creates one new diploid individual, and it starts with that one cell, that zygote. All right, so that logic, we have to be very clear on that. Okay, and I'm going to stop there and let you ponder that a little bit, and you might want to take a break and send me ask me some questions if you need to.